There are 14 graves beneath the old magnolia trees at Riverside Plantation. No headstones, no markers, only shallow depressions in the earth that refuse to settle properly, even after more than a century. When surveyor Thomas Hartwell was hired to map the property boundaries in 1891, he noticed something peculiar about the soil composition in that specific area. His metal detector registered iron fragments in the ground, chains, he would later discover. But it was the uniformity of the disturbances that caught his attention. 14 graves, all the same depth, all oriented the same direction, and according to his measurements, all dug and filled on the exact same night. The question that haunted everyone who learned of this discovery was simple: what happened at Riverside Plantation that required 14 people to be buried in secret all at once? The answer, as Hartwell would eventually learn from the few surviving witnesses, was far more complex and troubling than any explanation involving disease or accident. It was a story about choice and consequence, about the terrible mathematics of human dignity, about the moment when survival becomes less important than self-respect. It was a story that challenged every comfortable assumption about power and resistance, about masters and the enslaved, about what people will endure and what they will not. But in 1891, standing in that grove with his surveying equipment and his detailed notes, Hartwell knew none of this yet. He only knew that something significant had happened here, something that had left its mark on the earth itself, and that the truth was waiting to be uncovered, if he could find someone willing to speak it. Samuel Brennan purchased Riverside Plantation in 1854 with money inherited from his late father's shipping business in Charleston. At 32 years old, he was ambitious but inexperienced in agriculture, a merchant's son who had spent his life calculating profit margins on cotton shipments rather than actually growing the crop. The property stretched across 800 acres along the Cooper River, with soil rich enough to grow quality cotton, but neglected enough to be affordable. The previous owner, Charles Dunmore, had died without heirs 3 years earlier, and the estate had fallen into disrepair during the lengthy legal disputes that followed. Samuel arrived with his wife, Margaret, and their 5-year-old daughter, Eleanor, in late March, when the dogwoods were blooming and the air smelled of fresh earth and possibility. The journey from Charleston had taken most of the day, their carriage bouncing along rutted roads that showed years of neglect. As they turned onto the long drive leading to the main house, Margaret gripped Samuel's hand tightly. "It's larger than I imagined," she said, though her tone suggested this wasn't necessarily a compliment. The plantation house itself was a 2-story structure with wide porches and columns that had once been white, but now bore the gray stains of weather and time. Paint peeled from the shutters, and several boards on the upper porch appeared loose or missing entirely. Vines had begun to claim the eastern wall, their tendrils creeping between the bricks. Inside, the furniture remained covered with sheets, and the windows were thick with dust that transformed the afternoon sunlight into a murky haze. Margaret walked through the rooms with increasing dismay, noting water damage on the ceiling of the dining room, a broken window in the parlor, and signs of rodent activity in what should have been the kitchen. Eleanor, less concerned with the house's condition, immediately began exploring with the fearless curiosity of childhood, her footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. "This will take months to make livable," Margaret said, pulling back a sheet to reveal a sofa with fabric so faded it was impossible to determine its original color. "We have time," Samuel replied, though he felt less confident than he sounded. "And we have workers." That last statement hung in the air uncomfortably. Samuel had purchased Riverside with 32 enslaved people already bound to the property, men, women, and children who came with the deed like livestock, their names listed in an appendix to the purchase contract. He had seen them briefly during his initial inspection, working in the fields or moving between the outbuildings, but he had not yet introduced himself as their new owner. The reality of this arrangement had troubled Margaret from the beginning. She had grown up in Charleston society where slavery was an accepted fact of life. But there was a difference between having household servants and owning an entire population of people whose labor and lives were completely under your control. She had expressed her concerns to Samuel during the negotiation process, but his ambition had overridden her reservations. "We'll treat them fairly," Samuel had promised. "Better than most. You'll see." But Margaret understood, even if Samuel didn't yet, that fair treatment within an inherently unfair system was a contradiction that would eventually demand resolution. For now, though, she focused on the practical work of making the house habitable, directing their personal servants, whom they had brought from Charleston, in the work of cleaning and repairing. That first evening, as the sun set over the Cooper River and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Samuel stood on the front porch and surveyed his new domain. 800 acres, 32 people, a house that needed extensive work, fields that hadn't produced a proper crop in 3 years. It was overwhelming and exhilarating in equal measure. He didn't notice the small group of people watching him from near the quarters, 3 older men and 2 women, their faces shadowed by the failing light, their expressions unreadable. They were taking the measure of their new master, just as he was taking the measure of his property. Though their calculations involved different variables, they were asking themselves the question that every enslaved person asked when ownership changed hands: would this one be better or worse than the last? Among them stood Henry, the plantation's overseer, a man in his 50s who had been born on Riverside and knew every acre of it better than anyone alive. He had survived Charles Dunmore's ownership through a combination of competence, careful deference, and the ability to anticipate what his master wanted before being asked. Now, watching Samuel Brennan on the porch, Henry was already beginning the complex work of understanding this new man's character, identifying his weaknesses and strengths, determining how to navigate the relationship in ways that might protect the people under his supervision. "What do you think?" asked the woman standing beside him. Her name was Judith, and she ran the kitchen operations. Henry was quiet for a long moment. "Too early to say. He's young. Might be idealistic. Those types can be unpredictable. Better than Dunmore." "Anyone would be better than Dunmore," Henry said quietly. "But that's a low standard." They stood in silence as darkness fell completely, watching the lights come on in the main house, watching their new owners begin their life at Riverside Plantation. None of them knew yet about the crisis that would come, about the choice that would need to be made, about the 14 graves that would mark the grove forever. For now, they simply waited to see what kind of man Samuel Brennan would prove to be. Samuel's first full day at Riverside began before dawn. Or rather, he had slept poorly, the unfamiliar sounds of the plantation keeping him alert. Frogs along the river, an owl hunting in the trees, the distant sound of someone coughing in the quarters. He rose with the first light and dressed quickly, intending to tour the property before the heat of the day made such exertion unbearable. He found Henry already awake and supervising the morning distribution of tools and work assignments. The overseer's small house was located between the main house and the quarters, a strategic position that allowed him to monitor both. Henry had been expecting Samuel's early appearance and had prepared accordingly. "Mr. Brennan," he said with a slight nod. "Figured you'd want to see the operation." "I do. Show me everything." They walked together through the plantation as the sun rose, Henry explaining the layout and condition of each section. The east fields, where cotton had been grown successfully for years, showed signs of depletion but could be revived with proper care and crop rotation. The west fields were more problematic, prone to flooding when the Cooper River ran high, the soil heavy with clay that made drainage difficult. Dunmore tried to expand production into the west fields, Henry explained as they stood at the edge of a particularly waterlogged section. Pushed people to work the land even after it flooded. Lost 3 people to fever as a result. They were working in standing water, breathing bad air. Samuel noticed how Henry phrased it, lost 3 people, as if they had been misplaced rather than killed by negligent working conditions. He filed this observation away, recognizing it as evidence of how Henry had learned to discuss sensitive topics with plantation owners. "We won't work flooded fields," Samuel said firmly. "It's not worth the risk." Henry showed no reaction, but Samuel noticed a slight relaxation in the man's shoulders, a tension he hadn't realized was there. They continued the tour. The plantation's infrastructure was extensive, but poorly maintained. There was a cotton gin that needed repair, several storage buildings with leaking roofs, a blacksmith's forge that hadn't been used in months, and a small hospital building that was empty except for a few broken cots and some ancient medical supplies. Dunmore didn't believe in medical care. Samuel asked, examining the neglected hospital. He believed in not spending money on anything that didn't directly produce cotton, Henry replied carefully. They visited the quarters next, a collection of small cabins arranged in 2 rows, each housing 1 or more families. The structures were basic wooden frames with clay-chinked walls, dirt floors, single rooms with fireplaces for cooking and heating. Some cabins showed signs of maintenance and care, small gardens, swept yards, minor repairs, while others were in poor condition, with gaps in the walls and roofs that sagged dangerously. Some of these need to be rebuilt, Samuel observed. Yes, sir. Been saying that for years. Samuel met the residents as they emerged from their cabins for the day's work. Henry introduced each person by name and function. Joseph, a field worker in his early 30s with 2 young sons, Diana, who worked primarily on cloth production and had a daughter about Eleanor's age, Marcus, whose back injury from the previous year still limited his mobility, Thomas, who had skills in carpentry and had been requesting permission to repair the cabins, Anna, who knew herbal medicine and had been functioning as an unofficial healer. Each introduction was brief, the interactions formal and distant. The people showed proper deference, yes, sir, no, sir, thank you, sir, but Samuel could feel the calculation behind their words, the careful performance of obedience that revealed nothing about their actual thoughts or feelings. Only one person met his eyes directly, a young woman named Grace, who was standing outside her cabin with a small child balanced on her hip. When Henry introduced her, she looked at Samuel with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not hostile, but not deferential either. Evaluating. "Morning, Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice neutral. "Good morning," Samuel replied, uncertain how to interpret this interaction. After they moved on, Samuel asked Henry about her. "Grace is independent-minded," Henry said carefully. "Smart, good worker, but she has a tendency to speak more freely than is always advisable." "Is that a problem?" "Depends on the master. For some it would be. For Dunmore it was. And for me?" Henry glanced at him. "That's what everyone's trying to figure out." They completed the tour at the grove, the stand of ancient magnolia trees that marked the western boundary of the cleared land. It was peaceful there, shaded and cool, even as the morning sun heated the rest of the plantation. Samuel noticed the uneven ground, the patches where grass grew thinner, but didn't understand their significance yet. "This area is not used for planting?" he asked. "No, sir. Ground's not suitable." Samuel accepted this explanation without question, not realizing that he was standing on the secret Henry and Judith and the others had kept for 4 years, not knowing that beneath his feet lay the evidence of what happened when enslaved people reached the limit of what they could endure. They returned to the main house for breakfast. Margaret had already organized the kitchen and was serving a simple meal of eggs and bread. "How was your tour?" she asked. "Educational," Samuel replied. "There's more work to be done than I realized." That seems to be true of everything about this place. Samuel spent the rest of the day in the small office that adjoined the main barn, reviewing the plantation's records. Charles Dunmore had been meticulous in his bookkeeping, recording every expense and income with detailed precision. Samuel traced the plantation's financial history through these ledgers, seeing the pattern of declining productivity that had characterized the final years of Dunmore's ownership. But there were gaps in the records, periods when no entries were made, when the careful tracking simply stopped. The longest gap was in July of 1850, 10 days without any notation, then a series of unusual expenditures when the record-keeping resumed. Payment to Dr. Silas Crawford, $45. Payment to Reverend John Walsh, $20. Payment for necessary materials and services, $75. Property record adjustment, 14 deceased, *. Samuel studied these entries with growing curiosity. What kind of event would require a doctor and a minister and significant expenditure on unspecified materials and services? And why had Dunmore stopped keeping records during the event itself? He made a note to ask Henry about it, not realizing that this question would begin the unraveling of Riverside's buried history. While Samuel learned about cotton production and Margaret supervised the house renovations, Eleanor Brennan was conducting her own exploration of Riverside Plantation. At 5 years old, she possessed the combination of fearlessness and curiosity that made adults nervous, wandering into places she wasn't supposed to go and asking questions that were difficult to answer. She had been specifically instructed to stay near the main house, but the instruction was vague enough that Eleanor interpreted it creatively. The grove of magnolia trees, she reasoned, was visible from the house, and therefore not really away from it. This logic was sound enough for a 5-year-old, and so on her third day at Riverside, she set off toward the massive trees that had captured her attention since arrival. The grove was cooler than the surrounding land, the thick canopy blocking much of the sunlight and creating a dim, cathedral-like atmosphere. The air smelled different here, earthier, damper, with an underlying scent Eleanor couldn't identify. She walked slowly through the space, running her hand along the rough bark of the magnolia, examining the glossy leaves that had fallen and created a thick carpet on the ground. That's when she noticed the patches of bare earth. There were 14 of them, arranged in 2 neat rows of 7 each. The grass grew around these patches, but not in them, as if something about the soil prevented proper growth. Eleanor, with a child's lack of preconception about what these might be, simply found them curious. She was kneeling beside one, examining the earth with her fingers, when a voice spoke behind her. "Child, you shouldn't be here alone." Eleanor turned to find an elderly woman watching her from the edge of the grove. The woman moved slowly, leaning heavily on a wooden walking stick, her face deeply lined with age, but her eyes were sharp and clear, taking in every detail of Eleanor's presence. "I'm not alone now," Eleanor pointed out reasonably. "You're here." The woman's mouth twitched, almost smiling. "What's your name, child?" "Eleanor Brennan. My papa owns this plantation now." "What's your name?" "Ruth. Ruth Campbell. I work in the main house kitchen." Eleanor stood and brushed dirt from her dress, a gesture her mother had repeated so many times it had become automatic. "Do you know why the grass doesn't grow here?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her expression becoming distant. "The earth's been disturbed. Sometimes when that happens, things don't grow back quite right." "Disturbed how?" "That's a complicated question." "I'm very smart," Eleanor said with the confidence of a bright child accustomed to adult praise. "I can understand complicated things." Ruth moved closer, her walking stick tapping against the exposed roots of a magnolia. She looked down at the patch of earth Eleanor had been examining, and something in her expression shifted. Grief, maybe. Or the weight of memory. "There are people buried here," Ruth said quietly. Eleanor's eyes widened. "Really? Like a cemetery?" "Something like that." "Where are the headstones?" "There aren't any." "Why not?" Ruth sat down carefully on a fallen log at the edge of the grove, her old bones protesting the movement. Eleanor, sensing a story, sat beside her without hesitation. "Because the people buried here weren't considered important enough for headstones," Ruth explained. "They died, and they were buried, and nobody wrote down their names or marked where they were laid to rest." "That's sad," Eleanor said with the straightforward emotional honesty of childhood. "Everyone's important." "I agree. But not everyone else does." "Do you know who they were?" Ruth looked at the girl beside her, this child of privilege who had wandered innocently into the plantation's darkest secret. She considered how to answer. How much truth a 5-year-old could carry. How much of the story needed to be told. "I knew them," Ruth said finally. "They were my friends. They lived here, worked here, had families here. They were people with names and stories and dreams, just like you." "How did they die?" "That's the complicated part." Eleanor waited, patient in the way children can be when they sense adults are struggling with difficult truths. "They made a choice," Ruth continued carefully. "A choice about how they wanted to live and what they were willing to accept. And that choice led to consequences. Bad consequences." "What kind of choice?" Ruth shook her head slowly. "You're young yet. Maybe when you're older, someone will explain it properly. For now, just know that these people deserve to be remembered, even though they don't have fancy stones with their names carved on them." Eleanor processed this information with serious concentration. Then she asked, "Can I help remember them?" "How would you do that?" "I could visit here sometimes. I could make sure nobody forgets about this place." Ruth felt something tighten in her chest, surprise, gratitude, hope, all mixed together. "You'd do that?" "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "Because everyone's important, and everyone should be remembered. From that day forward, Eleanor made the grove part of her daily routine. She would collect wildflowers from the fields and lay them on the patches of disturbed earth, one flower for each grave. She didn't understand the full story yet, wouldn't understand for years, but she grasped the essential truth that this was a place of significance, a place that deserved attention and care. Ruth often found her there and would sit with her, gradually sharing more details about the people who rested beneath the magnolias. Not the full story, not the terrible conclusion, but the human details that made them real. Joseph loved to sing. Diana could braid hair in beautiful patterns. Marcus carved small wooden animals for the children. These visits didn't go unnoticed. The other enslaved people at Riverside observed Eleanor's attention to the grove with a mixture of confusion and cautious approval. Here was the master's daughter, treating their dead with respect, acknowledging losses that had been officially buried and forgotten. Margaret noticed as well, and was considerably less approving. "You need to stop letting her go to that place," she told Samuel one evening after Eleanor had been put to bed. "What place?" "The grove. Where the previous slaves are buried." Samuel looked up from the agricultural journal he had been reading. "How do you know there are slaves buried there?" "The servants told me." "Everyone knows. It's where Dunmore buried his dead." "Then it's a cemetery, and there's nothing inappropriate about a child visiting a cemetery." Margaret's voice rose in frustration. "It's not a proper cemetery, Samuel. There are no markers, no Christian burial, no what? No recognition that the people buried there were human beings worthy of respect." The argument continued, circling around fundamental disagreements about propriety and humanity, about what Eleanor should be exposed to and what she should be protected from, about whether acknowledging the dead of Riverside Plantation was appropriate or dangerous. In the end, Samuel decided that Eleanor could continue her visits, though Margaret extracted a promise that the girl would always be accompanied by an adult. This compromise satisfied no one, but at least prevented further conflict. What neither Samuel nor Margaret realized was that Eleanor's attention to the grove was already changing something at Riverside. The people who had maintained the secret for 4 years were beginning to wonder if perhaps the new master's family might be different enough that the truth could finally be spoken aloud. As spring progressed into early summer, Samuel became increasingly absorbed in the work of reviving Riverside's productivity. He studied agricultural techniques, consulted with experienced planters from neighboring properties, and made careful decisions about planting schedules and resource allocation. The cotton fields were showing promising growth, and Samuel allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic about the plantation's prospects. But there were aspects of Riverside that troubled him, details that didn't quite fit together, silences that felt deliberately maintained. The workers were productive, but subdued, completing their assigned tasks with efficient silence. There were none of the work songs Samuel had heard on other plantations. None of the conversations or laughter he had expected. People moved through their labor like ghosts, present, but not fully alive. He mentioned this to Henry during one of their regular meetings. "They're very quiet," Samuel observed. "Is there a reason?" Henry considered his answer carefully. "People work different ways, Mr. Brennan. Some plantations have more spirit, I suppose you'd call it. Riverside has had a harder history." "Harder how?" "Mr. Dunmore was demanding. People learned it was safer to work quietly and not draw attention. But Dunmore has been dead for 3 years. Surely they'd feel comfortable expressing themselves now." "Habits run deep, sir. And people are still figuring out what kind of master you'll be." Samuel found this answer unsatisfying, but didn't know how to push further. He had no experience reading the subtle dynamics of enslaved communities, no understanding of how trauma shaped behavior across years. He also noticed that certain topics seemed to create visible tension. Any mention of the summer of 1850 made people uncomfortable. Questions about the grove elicited vague responses about ground not being suitable for planting. Inquiries about the gaps in Dunmore's records were met with variations of, "I don't recall the details, sir." The most dramatic example came during a conversation with Judith, who ran the kitchen operations. Samuel had asked her about meal planning, and whether there were any seasonal considerations he should understand. Well, sir, Judith said carefully, summer can be difficult. The heat affects how much people can work. And if they're not getting enough food and water, problems develop quick. What kind of problems? Judith hesitated, glancing toward the door as if checking for listeners. Exhaustion. Heat sickness. Back in 50, there was a bad spell when she stopped abruptly, her expression closing down. The July that's missing from the records. I wouldn't know about the records, sir. But you were here. You remember what happened? I remember there was sickness. That's all. The conversation ended there, but Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being told a carefully edited version of the truth. Everyone knew something, but no one was willing to say what. His frustration grew until finally, in mid-June, he confronted Henry directly. They were in the equipment shed, reviewing an inventory of tools that needed repair or replacement. Samuel had been making notes in a ledger when he came across the entries from July 1850 again, the gap, the mysterious expenditures, the notation of 14 deceased. Henry, I need to know what happened in the summer of 1850. The overseer's hand stilled on the plow blade he had been examining. Mr. Brennan. No. No more evasions. Every person on this plantation knows what happened, and everyone's protecting the secret. I can't run this property effectively if I don't understand its history. Some history is better left alone. That's not your decision to make. Henry set down the plow blade and turned to face Samuel fully. His expression was a mixture of reluctance and resignation, the look of a man being forced to do something he had long resisted. You really want to know? Yes. Even if the knowing changes everything? Even if you can't unknow it once you've heard it? Yes. Henry was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Then he said, the person you need to talk to is Ruth. She was there. She saw everything from beginning to end. She can tell you what happened better than I can. Why won't you tell me? Because I was part of it, Mr. Brennan. I made choices that summer. Did things I'm not proud of. Failed to do things I should have done. Ruth can give you the story without, he paused, searching for words. Without the guilt getting in the way. Samuel studied Henry's face and saw something there he hadn't seen before, shame, deep and old and unresolved. Whatever had happened 4 years ago, it still haunted the overseer. All right, Samuel said. I'll talk to Ruth. When you do, Henry said quietly, remember that the people involved didn't have good choices. They had terrible choices and impossible choices, and they did the best they could with what they had. Try to remember that while you're judging them. I'm not interested in judging. I'm interested in understanding. Sometimes those things can't be separated. That evening, after the day's work was complete and the plantation had settled into its nightly rhythms, Samuel went to find Ruth. He located her outside her cabin, sitting on a 3-legged stool and snapping green beans into a bowl. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of orange and crimson. Ruth, I need to talk to you. She looked up, unsurprised by his appearance. I know what you want to talk about. Henry told me you'd been asking questions. Will you tell me what happened? Ruth set aside the bowl of beans and gestured to a log that had been positioned near the cabin as an informal seat. Samuel sat, and Ruth remained on her stool, her old hands folding together in her lap. Before I tell you, she said, I want you to understand something. What happened that summer wasn't inevitable. It was the result of choices. Dunmore's choices, mostly, but others too. And once I tell you the whole story, you'll carry it with you. It'll change how you see this place, how you see the people here. Maybe how you see yourself. You sure you want that? I'm sure. Ruth nodded slowly. All right, then. I'll tell you about the summer of 1850, and about the 14 graves in the grove, and about how ordinary people ended up making extraordinary choices because there was nothing ordinary left available to them. Ruth's voice took on the quality of someone who had told this story before, at least to herself, in the quiet hours of night. Samuel listened without interruption as she began. The trouble started in June of 1850, though the seeds had been planted long before that. Mr. Dunmore had always been demanding, expected hard work, long hours, didn't tolerate what he considered laziness, but he'd been manageable, in the way a harsh master can be manageable if you know the rules and follow them. Then he got word from Charleston that his creditors were getting impatient. The plantation hadn't been producing the way it used to, and he owed money to the banks, to his suppliers, to other planters he'd borrowed from. They were threatening to call in his debts, which meant he'd lose Riverside if he couldn't pay. Dunmore's response was to increase production immediately. He cut the break time during work, added hours to each day, eliminated the Sunday rest period. He said we'd work harder until the plantation was profitable again, and anyone who couldn't keep up would be sold south, to the rice plantations. Samuel knew enough about plantation economics to understand the threat. The rice plantations in the Deep South were notorious for brutal conditions and high mortality rates. Being sold south was one of the worst fates an enslaved person could face. How did people respond? He asked. Most tried to keep up. What choice did they have? You work, or you get punished, sold, killed. Those are the options when you're someone's property. But the pace Dunmore was demanding wasn't sustainable, especially not in summer heat. Joseph tried to talk to Dunmore about it. Asked respectfully if there could be more water breaks, shorter work periods during the hottest part of the day. Dunmore had him whipped for insubordination. 10 lashes in front of everyone, to make sure we all understood that there would be no negotiating. After that, people stopped complaining. They just tried to survive. July came in hot, hotter than anyone could remember. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer, makes you dizzy just standing still. And Dunmore pushed harder. Longer hours, faster pace, less water, less food, because he said we were eating into the profit margins. Then a girl named Sarah collapsed. Ruth paused, her hands tightening in her lap. Samuel waited, sensing that this was where the story turned from difficult to unbearable. Sarah was 14. Sweet girl, always singing while she worked. She'd been in the field since before dawn that day. No shade, no breaks. Temperature must have been close to 100 degrees. She just fell right into the cotton plants. Didn't make a sound. Just went down like someone had cut her strings. Henry carried her back to the quarters. We tried everything, cool water, shade, fanning her to bring down the fever. Nothing worked. She died just after sunset. Dunmore's response was to say we'd work an extra hour the next day to make up for the lost productivity. Samuel felt his stomach turn. He didn't even acknowledge that she'd died because of his orders. No, sir. He didn't acknowledge that at all. Called it a weakness in her constitution. Said he'd make sure to buy heartier stock in the future. That's the word he used, stock. Like she was a horse that had gone lame. Ruth's voice had remained steady throughout this recitation, but Samuel could hear the anger beneath the calm surface, fury that had been banked for 4 years, but never extinguished. That's when everything changed, Ruth continued. People weren't just scared anymore. They were angry, the kind of angry that burns away fear, at least for a while. Ruth stood slowly, her old bones protesting, and walked a few steps toward the grove, visible in the distance as a dark mass of trees against the darkening sky. Henry called a meeting that night. Everyone came, except the smallest children. We left them sleeping in the cabins with a few of the oldest women watching over them. We gathered in the space behind the quarters where we could talk without being heard from the main house. Nobody knew what to expect. Meetings like that were dangerous. If Dunmore found out, there would be consequences. But Sarah's death had broken something open, and everyone needed to talk about what came next. Joseph spoke first. His wife had died 2 years before from fever, and he was raising his 2 sons alone. He said, very quietly, "This can't continue. Dunmore is going to kill us all, one at a time, and call it natural causes." Diana agreed. She worked on cloth production mostly, but Dunmore had been sending her to the fields, too, trying to squeeze more work out of everyone. She held up her hands. They were torn up from the cotton bolls, bleeding through the cloth wraps she'd made. She said, "I can't feel my fingers anymore." Another week of this, and I won't be able to hold anything at all. Marcus, who'd been injured the year before when a cotton bale fell on him, said his back had gotten worse from the increased workload. He couldn't straighten all the way anymore, spent his nights in pain. One by one, people shared their stories, not complaining, exactly, just stating facts. This is what's happening to my body. This is what's being taken from me. This is what I'm losing. Then Thomas asked the question everyone was thinking, what do we do about it? Someone suggested running, just leaving in the night, heading north, taking our chances. But Joseph shook his head. Dogs, he said. Catchers. Dunmore has connections across 3 states. And even if some of us made it, he'd take it out on whoever stayed behind. You know he would. Someone else suggested slowing down the work, making mistakes, subtle sabotage that would hurt production without being obviously intentional. But Diana pointed out that Dunmore would just increase the hours even more, punish people until the pace picked up again. We went around and around like that for an hour, proposing and discarding ideas. Nothing seemed like it would work. Nothing seemed like it would change the fundamental situation. We were trapped, and Dunmore held all the power. Then Grace spoke. You met her, young woman with the baby. Back then, she didn't have children yet. Was only 19 years old. She'd been quiet through most of the meeting, just listening. But finally she said, what if we stopped trying to win? What if we just tried to end it on our terms? Everyone looked at her. Nobody understood what she meant at first. I mean, Grace continued, we can't beat Dunmore. We can't escape him. We can't negotiate with him. But we can choose how this story ends for us. We can decide that we'd rather die standing up than live another day on our knees. The silence that followed was profound, because everyone understood immediately what she was suggesting, and everyone knew she was right. There was no winning scenario. There was only choosing between different kinds of losing. Ruth turned back to face Samuel, and in the gathering darkness he could see tears on her weathered cheeks. That's when Henry said, anyone who wants to make that choice, I'll stand with you. But it has to be a choice. Nobody gets pressured. Nobody gets guilt into it. You decide for yourself if you'd rather die free than live enslaved. And 14 people said yes. Samuel sat in stunned silence, trying to process what Ruth was telling him. His mind kept rejecting the implications, searching for alternative interpretations that would make the story less horrifying. They chose. They decided to. He couldn't finish the sentence. They decided to confront Dunmore and accept the consequences, Ruth said. They knew what would happen. Knew he'd kill them rather than accept defiance. But they were done being property. Done being used up and thrown away. They wanted one moment of choosing for themselves, even if that moment cost them everything. But Samuel struggled for words. That's not resistance. That's suicide. Ruth's voice was sharp. When your choices are work yourself to death slowly, or die standing up for your dignity, which one is really suicide? At least they got to decide. At least they got to look Dunmore in the eye and say no before the end. Samuel had no response to that. The logic was irrefutable, even as it horrified him. Who were they? He asked. The 14. Ruth sat back down on her stool, her movements slow and pained. I'll tell you about each one, because they deserve to be known as people, not just numbers in a tragic story. Joseph Harris was 32, had 2 sons, ages 7 and 5. Strongest man on the plantation, could carry twice what anyone else could. Loved to sing, had a voice that could carry across the fields, deep and rich. His boys adored him. Diana Wells was 29. Could braid hair in patterns so intricate they looked like art. Had a daughter who was 8. Diana had been teaching her to read in secret, using a Bible she'd found hidden in the main house years before. Marcus Reed was 41. Before his injury, he'd been the plantation's best carpenter. Could fix anything, build anything. He carved small wooden animals for the children, horses, birds, rabbits. Every child here had at least one of Marcus's carvings. Thomas Carter was 23. Was courting Grace, actually. Planned to ask Dunmore's permission to marry her. He was gentle, patient, the kind of person who never raised his voice even when he had every reason to. Anna Price was 35. Knew herbs and healing. She's the one who took care of people when they got sick or injured. Delivered most of the babies born on this plantation in the last 10 years. James Foster was 27. Could tell stories that made everyone laugh no matter how tired they were. Had a gift for mimicking people's voices and mannerisms. Even in the worst times, James could find something to make people smile. Eliza Hayes was 31. Made beautiful quilts from scraps of fabric. Every quilt told a story, though you had to know how to read the patterns to understand them. Some of her quilts were maps, actually, ways to navigate north if anyone ever tried to run. William Grant was 19. Fastest runner anyone had ever seen. Could outpace the dogs if given a head start. He'd been planning to run north, had been studying Eliza's quilts to learn the route. But after Sarah died, he decided he'd rather stand with his community than save himself alone. Rebecca Shaw was 42. Knew dozens of spirituals by heart. Led the singing on Sundays when Dunmore allowed us to gather for services. Had a voice like an angel, clear and pure and full of longing. Daniel Brooks was 38. Was gentle with animals. Horses that were fractious with everyone else would calm down for Daniel. Dogs would follow him around like he was their master. Children, too, they gravitated to him because he never lost patience, never got angry. Sarah Monroe was 22. Yes, same name as the girl who collapsed. They weren't related, but they'd been close friends. After Sarah the younger died, Sarah the elder said she couldn't keep going, couldn't keep working for the men who'd killed her friend. John Ellis was 53, the oldest of the 14. Had been born on this plantation, worked here his entire life. His wife had died years before, his children sold away when Dunmore needed money. He had nothing left but his dignity, and he wanted to die with it intact. Catherine Wright was 26. Could sew anything. Made all the clothes for the plantation from raw fabric. Her stitches were so neat and even they looked like machine work. She had nimble fingers and endless patience. Robert Stone was 34. Had been teaching himself to play the fiddle. He'd found a broken one in the main house storage and had been slowly repairing it, teaching himself songs by ear. He could play 3 songs well enough to dance to. Those were the 14. Each one a complete person with skills and dreams and connections to others. Each one loved by someone. Each one convinced that dying with dignity was better than living without it. Ruth paused in her telling, accepting a dipper of water Samuel had retrieved from the well. She drank slowly, gathering her strength to continue. They spent 2 days preparing, not preparing weapons or planning an escape, but preparing themselves mentally and spiritually for what they decided to do. Joseph spent time with his sons, teaching them things he wanted them to remember, how to track animals in the woods, how to start a fire without flint, how to tell which plants were safe to eat. He didn't tell them what he was planning. How do you explain something like that to children? But I think some part of him hoped that the lessons would help them survive whatever came after. Diana wrote down everything she'd been teaching her daughter about reading. She couldn't risk keeping written material. If Dunmore found it, it would mean punishment for everyone, so she had to trust her daughter's memory. She spent hours going over letters and sounds, making sure it was all firmly lodged in the girl's mind. Marcus finished a set of wooden carvings he'd been working on, one for each of the children on the plantation. He distributed them the night before, telling each child to keep their animal safe and remember who made it for them. Thomas finally told Grace how he felt about her. Asked if she'd consider marrying him if he survived what was coming. She said yes, knowing it was an impossible dream, but needing to say it anyway. The others made similar preparations. Anna organized all her healing knowledge and passed it on to a woman named Beth who had been helping her. James taught some of his stories to the children. Eliza gave away her quilts. Rebecca taught her songs to younger singers. They were settling their affairs, like people do when they know death is coming. Henry tried to talk them out of it. I was there when he made his final appeal the night before it happened. He gathered the 14 together and begged them to reconsider. There might be another way, he said. Give me time to think, to plan. This doesn't have to end in death. But Joseph shook his head. We've given this system our whole lives. We've worked and bled and watched our people die. We're done giving. Tomorrow we take something back. Our right to say no. Our right to choose. Even if the choice is only about how we die. You have children, Henry said. People depending on you. What happens to them after you're gone? What happens to them if we stay? Diana replied. They grow up enslaved just like we did. They watch their parents be worked to death. They lose their own children to sale or disease or exhaustion. Is that better? Henry had no answer to that. At least they'll know, Thomas said quietly, that their parents had dignity at the end. At least they'll know we chose, even if we chose death. Henry turned to me then. I'd been standing at the edge of the group, listening. Ruth, tell them this is madness. But I couldn't, because I understood their logic, even if I couldn't follow it myself. I was older, more afraid, less brave. But I understood. It's their choice to make, I told Henry. Not yours, not mine. Theirs. So Henry stopped arguing. Instead he said, I'll be there. When it happens, I'll be there. You won't face it alone. And that seemed to comfort them, knowing that at least one person would witness their stand, would remember it properly, would tell their children what had really happened when they were old enough to understand. Ruth fell silent, staring at nothing, lost in the memory of that night. They chose July 15th because it was supposed to be the hottest day of the summer, Ruth continued, her voice dropping lower. They wanted Dunmore to see exactly what his demands had driven them to. Wanted him to understand that the heat he was forcing them to work in was unbearable. They gathered just after dawn, before the work bell rang. All 14 of them, dressed in their best clothes, or at least the least ragged ones they owned. They wanted to face death looking like people, not like the animals Dunmore treated them as. The rest of us watched from the quarters. Word had spread about what was going to happen, though the 14 had tried to keep it quiet. You can't hide something like that in a community this small. Everyone knew, and everyone was terrified and heartbroken and, if I'm honest, a little bit proud. They walked together to the main house. Didn't march or shout or make threats. Just walked, with quiet dignity. 14 people who had decided they were done being slaves. Dunmore was on the front porch like he was every morning, drinking his coffee and reviewing the day's work assignments. He saw them coming, and his face went red immediately. He knew, you could see it in his expression, that this was defiance. And defiance was the one thing he absolutely couldn't tolerate. What do you think you're doing? He shouted. Get to the fields. Now. They stopped about 20 feet from the porch. Joseph stepped forward slightly, making himself the spokesman. Mr. Dunmore, he said, his voice calm and steady. We're not working today. We're not working tomorrow. We're done. The silence that followed was absolute. Birds stopped singing. Wind stopped rustling the trees. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. You're what? Dunmore's voice was soft, dangerous. Done, Joseph repeated. We're not your slaves anymore. Not in our hearts. You can own our bodies under the law, but you don't own us. Not anymore. Dunmore set down his coffee cup very carefully. I'm going to give you one chance to get back to work. One chance. After that, there will be consequences you can't imagine. We've imagined them, Diana said. We've imagined every consequence, and we've decided they're preferable to another day of this. Dunmore went inside. We all knew what he was getting. He kept rifles just inside the front door, within easy reach for situations exactly like this. When he came back out, he was carrying one. Last chance, he said, raising the rifle. I'll shoot. I'll kill every last one of you. We know, Joseph replied. And that's when Dunmore realized what was happening. You could see it on his face, the understanding that he'd pushed these people past fear, past survival instinct, into a place where death was acceptable if it came with dignity. He'd always controlled through threat, but threats only work on people who want to live on any terms. These 14 had reached different terms. "You're forcing me to do this," Dunmore said. And I think he actually believed it. In his mind, he was the victim. These uppity slaves were making him kill them. "We're not forcing anything," Thomas said. "We're choosing. You're choosing, too. You could choose to let us go. You could choose to hear what we're saying. But you won't, because you can't imagine a world where we have choices. So yes, you're going to shoot. But understand this, you're not killing slaves who defied you. You're killing people who freed themselves and paid the price for that freedom." Dunmore fired. Ruth's voice cracked, and tears streamed down her face openly now. Joseph fell, just collapsed, like Sarah had collapsed in the field. The others didn't run, didn't scream. They stood there together and waited for what came next. Dunmore reloaded and fired again. Diana fell, then Marcus, then Thomas. It took him nearly an hour to kill them all. He had to reload after each shot, and I think part of him kept hoping they'd break, run, beg for mercy. But they didn't. Each person stood there calmly, watched their friends die, and waited their turn. Anna was singing when she died, one of Rebecca's spirituals. Rebecca joined in, and soon all of them who were still alive were singing. Their voices got quieter as there were fewer of them, but they sang until the last one fell. Robert was last. He just looked at Dunmore and said, "My name is Robert Stone. Remember it." Then he died, too. Dunmore stood there for a long time after, staring at the bodies. I think he was in shock. He'd expected them to break, and they hadn't, and he didn't know what to do with people who chose death over submission. Finally, he went back inside without a word. That's when Henry walked out from where he'd been standing. He positioned himself where he could see everything but where Dunmore wouldn't notice him. He went to each body and checked for life. Some had died instantly. Others took longer, bleeding out or struggling to breathe with damaged lungs. Henry stayed with each person until they passed, held their hands, spoke to them quietly, made sure they didn't die alone. Ruth wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, struggling to compose herself enough to continue. After the last one died, Henry started digging. He chose the grove because the magnolias gave shade, and because it was far enough from the main house that Dunmore wouldn't have to see the graves if he didn't want to. The rest of us came to help. We dug 14 graves in that hard summer earth, working in silence because nobody trusted themselves to speak without breaking down completely. It took hours. We weren't strong, weren't rested, weren't fed well enough for that kind of labor. But we did it. We wrapped each body in whatever cloth we had, sheets, spare clothes, anything that would serve as a shroud. It wasn't proper. Wasn't what they deserved. But it was what we could manage. Some people wanted to mark the graves somehow, but Henry said no. Said it was safer for everyone if the location wasn't obviously a cemetery, if there were no markers that could be seen from a distance. He was thinking about the living, about protecting us from anyone who might see marked graves and start asking questions about how 14 people died on the same day. So we buried them in unmarked graves, 2 neat rows of 7, all facing east according to the custom we'd learned from our grandparents. We said what prayers we knew, a mixture of Christian verses and older traditions, words passed down through generations. Some people sang. Some just stood there crying. When the last grave was filled and the earth packed down, Henry said, their names were Joseph Harris, Diana Wells, Marcus Reed, Thomas Carter, Anna Price, James Foster, Eliza Hayes, William Grant, Rebecca Shaw, Daniel Brooks, Sarah Monroe, John Ellis, Catherine Wright, and Robert Stone. Say their names so you remember. Say their names so they live on. And we all repeated the names. 14 names spoken by dozens of voices. We must have stood there for an hour, saying the names over and over, burning them into our memory so they could never be forgotten. Then we went back to the quarters. And the next morning, Dunmore came out and rang the work bell like nothing had happened. Samuel sat in horrified silence, unable to find words adequate to what he had just heard. What about the authorities? He finally managed. Didn't anyone report the murders? Ruth's laugh was bitter. Report to who? The sheriff who was Dunmore's friend. The courts that considered us property. The law that said a master could discipline his slaves as he saw fit, up to and including death. Besides, Dunmore made it official and legal. He brought in Dr. Crawford from Charleston, paid him to document that 14 people had died from fever during an outbreak. Paid Reverend Walsh to record the deaths in the church registry as colored deceased, natural causes. Paid a lawyer to update the property records, reducing the asset value of the plantation by the market price of 14 slaves. All neat and legal on paper. The official story was that disease swept through the quarters in July of 1850, and 14 people succumbed. Nobody questioned it, because nobody cared enough to question it. We were property that had been lost. Nothing more. The truth was buried with them in that grove. And until you came along asking questions, we've kept it buried. Samuel sat with Ruth's story for a long time, turning it over in his mind, trying to process the moral complexity of what he'd learned. Finally, he asked, what happened to the children? The ones left behind. Joseph's sons were raised by their aunt. Diana's daughter was eventually sold to a plantation in Georgia. Dunmore needed money again and decided she was old enough to bring a good price. Grace never recovered from losing Thomas. She stayed on at Riverside, but something in her had died along with him. The rest of us just continued. We worked for Dunmore for 3 more years until his death. Every day we worked in fields where we'd seen our friends murdered. Every night we slept in quarters where we could see the grove from our windows. We carried that weight, that knowledge, that grief. And we kept the secret, because the truth wouldn't have brought justice. It would only have brought more death. Better to let the official story stand. Let people think it was fever. Protect the memory of the 14 from being twisted into something it wasn't. But the secret has eaten at you, Samuel said. Every day for 4 years, Ruth confirmed. Every day I've wondered if we should have told someone, should have made the truth public, should have demanded some kind of accountability. But who would we tell? Who would have cared? Who would have done anything except punish us for speaking out? Samuel had no answer. He was beginning to understand the impossible position these people had been in. We're still in. And now, he asked. What happens now that I know? Ruth looked at him steadily. That depends on you, Mr. Brennan. You're the master now. You own us, just like Dunmore did. The law hasn't changed. Our circumstances haven't changed. The only question is what kind of man you are, and what you'll do with this knowledge. I'm not Dunmore, Samuel said firmly. Maybe not. But you're still the master of a plantation built on enslaved labor. You still profit from our work. You still have legal authority to sell us, punish us, work us until we die. Knowing the story doesn't change those facts. Samuel felt the weight of this truth settling on him. Ruth was right. His good intentions didn't alter the fundamental wrong of the situation. He might be kinder than Dunmore, might treat the people at Riverside with more humanity, but the system remained unchanged. What would you have me do? He asked. I can't tell you that. This is your burden now, your choice to make. Just like those 14 made their choice, you have to make yours. I just hope you choose better than Dunmore did. Samuel walked back to the main house in darkness, Ruth's words echoing in his mind. He found Margaret waiting for him, concern evident on her face. You were gone for hours. What did you learn? Samuel told her everything. The work conditions, Sarah's death, the decision of the 14, the confrontation, the murders, the secret burial. Margaret listened with growing horror, her hand covering her mouth. When he finished, she was crying. We can't stay here, she whispered. Samuel, we can't build our life on top of that much death and suffering. We invested everything in this property. We have nowhere else to go. Then what do we do? Just pretend we don't know. Work these people and take their labor and act like 14 people weren't murdered 50 yards from our house. I don't know, Samuel admitted. But I know we have to do something. We can't unknow this truth, and we can't ignore it. They sat together in the dark parlor, two people confronted with a moral burden they hadn't expected to carry, grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Samuel didn't sleep that night. He paced the upstairs hallway, thinking about Joseph and Diana and Marcus and the 11 others, about their children left behind, about the weight of secrets and the cost of truth. By dawn, he had reached a decision. He found Henry at first light, before the day's work began. I want to mark the graves, Samuel said without preamble. Proper markers with names. Ruth knows who they were. We'll have stones carved and install them in the grove. Henry stared at him. Mr. Brennan, do you understand what that would mean? You'd be acknowledging what happened, making it public. The truth should be public. Those people deserve to be remembered properly. And what about the living? What about the people here who've been protecting that secret? You make it public, and suddenly everyone knows Riverside is the place where slaves defied their master. Other planters might see that as dangerous, might put pressure on you to make an example of the people still here. Samuel hadn't considered this. The regional politics of plantation ownership were complex, with unwritten rules about how to handle labor problems and maintain social order. A public acknowledgement of what had happened might be seen as encouraging further resistance. What would you suggest? He asked. Henry considered carefully. If it were my choice, which it isn't, I'd find a way to honor them that doesn't put a target on the living. Something that means something to those who know, but doesn't advertise to those who might use it as an excuse for cruelty. They talked for hours, debating options and consequences. Samuel consulted with Ruth, with Judith, with several others who had witnessed the events of July 1850. Gradually, a compromise took shape. Instead of formal headstones that would draw attention, Samuel would plant living memorials, trees that would bloom each year, marking the graves in a way that could be explained innocuously to outsiders, but would carry deep meaning for those who understood. He selected dogwood trees specifically because of their symbolism. The white flowers resembled crosses, and legend held that the dogwood had been used to build Christ's cross, a tree that suffered but survived, that bloomed each spring as a reminder of resurrection. It seemed appropriate for people who had chosen death over degradation, who had suffered but maintained their dignity. Samuel also commissioned a single bronze plaque to be installed on a stone in the grove. The inscription would tell truth without providing details that might endanger the living. Here rest 14 souls who chose dignity over survival. Their names are known to those who love them. July 15, 1850, *. It was a compromise between silence and full disclosure, between protecting the living and honoring the dead. Samuel purchased 14 young dogwood saplings from a nursery in Charleston, explaining to the proprietor that he was creating a memorial grove for family members. The lie came easily, which troubled him, but he recognized the necessity of maintaining some level of secrecy. He also had Ruth write down the 14 names in careful script, including details about each person, their ages, their skills, their families. This record would be kept in the plantation's official books, a private archive that would preserve their stories for future generations. The memorial ceremony was planned for late September, when the worst of the summer heat had passed and the work of planting trees would be less physically demanding. On the chosen morning, Samuel gave everyone at Riverside the day off from work. This decision raised eyebrows among the neighboring planters, who somehow learned of it, but Samuel didn't care. This was a day for remembering, not working. The entire plantation community gathered in the grove, more than 30 people, including children who had never fully understood what had happened there 4 years ago. Samuel had Henry set up rough benches made from split logs, creating a space that felt like an outdoor chapel. Eleanor stood beside her parents, holding her mother's hand tightly. At 8 years old, she still didn't know the full story, but she understood this was significant. Henry stood before the group and began to speak. We're here to remember 14 people who lived on this land, who worked this soil, who were part of this community. Their names were Joseph Harris, Diana Wells, Marcus Reed, Thomas Carter, Anna Price, James Foster, Eliza Hayes, William Grant, Rebecca Shaw, Daniel Brooks, Sarah Monroe, John Ellis, Catherine Wright, and Robert Stone. As Henry read each name, he paused, and someone from the crowd would share a memory or detail about that person. After Joseph's name, he could sing like nobody else. His voice carried across the fields and made the work feel lighter. After Diana's name, she taught my daughter to read. Risked everything to give that gift. After Marcus's name, he carved me a rabbit when I was 6 years old. I still have it. I'll keep it forever. The testimonies continued, building a portrait of 14 complete human lives, each one rich with relationships and skills and dreams. By the time all 14 names had been read and remembered, many people were crying, not just grief, but a mixture of sorrow and pride and relief that finally, after 4 years of secrecy, the truth was being acknowledged. Samuel stepped forward to speak next. I didn't know these people, he said. I'll never know them the way you did. But I've learned their stories, and I understand what they did and why they did it. They made a choice that shouldn't have been necessary, a choice between dignity and survival, and they chose dignity. He paused, feeling the weight of his next words. I can't undo what happened to them. I can't bring them back or give them justice. But I can do this. I can make sure they're remembered. I can plant these trees so that every spring when they bloom, we're reminded of their courage and their humanity. And I can promise that as long as I own this land, their story will not be forgotten. It was a small thing, inadequate to the scope of the tragedy. But it was what Samuel could offer. The planting began. Samuel planted the first dogwood himself, his hands sinking into the soft earth over Joseph's grave. He worked carefully, making sure the roots were properly positioned, the soil packed firmly but not too tightly. Margaret planted the second tree over Diana's grave, with Eleanor helping to hold the sapling steady. Then, one by one, members of the community planted the remaining 12 trees. Joseph's sons, now teenagers, planted the tree over their father's grave together, tears streaming down their faces. Grace planted the tree over Thomas's grave, whispering something nobody else could hear. An older woman who had been Anna's apprentice planted that tree, touching the bark gently before stepping back. When all 14 trees were planted, Ruth stepped forward. She had prepared something to say, words that had been forming in her heart for 4 years. These folks made a choice that haunts everyone who witnessed it, she said, her voice carrying across the grove. But they made it together, and they faced it together, and now they rest together. We remember them not just for how they died, but for who they were while they lived. They were singers and storytellers, healers and craftsmen, teachers and dreamers. They were people who loved and were loved. And as long as we remember, they're not really gone. Everyone stood in silence, the morning sun filtering through the magnolia branches and casting dappled light on the freshly planted dogwoods. Then someone began to sing, one of the spirituals Rebecca had been known for. Others joined in, voices rising and falling, creating harmonies that seemed to fill the grove and spill out into the surrounding fields. Samuel stood with his family, listening to the song, and felt something shift inside him. He couldn't fix the system. He couldn't undo the past. But he could bear witness, could create space for truth and memory, could make choices that acknowledged the humanity of the people he claimed to own. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was what he could do, and so he would do it. Word of the memorial spread quickly through the regional planter community. Within 2 weeks, Samuel was receiving visitors, some curious, some concerned, some openly hostile. James Whitfield, who owned a neighboring plantation, was among the first to arrive. He found Samuel in the office reviewing crop reports. "Brennan, we need to talk about what you did." Samuel looked up. "What I did?" "This memorial ceremony. Honoring slaves who defied their master. Do you have any idea what kind of message that sends? I honored people who died on my property. That's all. That's not all, and you know it. Word is you're treating the defiance as some kind of heroic act. Planting trees and holding ceremonies. You're making martyrs out of people who should have been examples of what happens when slaves get uppity." Samuel felt anger rising. They weren't slaves in that moment. They were people choosing dignity over degradation. They were property refusing to work. And you're celebrating that. The argument continued. Whitfield insisting that Samuel's actions were dangerous, that they could inspire similar acts on other plantations, that the social order depended on enslaved people understanding the absolute nature of their master's authority. Samuel defended his decision, arguing that acknowledging humanity wasn't the same as encouraging rebellion, that treating people with basic respect actually made them more cooperative, not less. But Whitfield was unmoved. He left with a warning: "You're going to find it difficult to do business in this region if you keep this up. Banks won't extend credit to someone who coddles his slaves. Buyers won't want cotton from a plantation known for having labor problems. You're isolating yourself, Brennan." And he was right. Over the following months, Samuel found that contracts were harder to secure, credit more difficult to obtain, social invitations dried up. Margaret's friends from Charleston stopped corresponding. When the Brennan family attended church, they were greeted politely but coolly, included out of obligation rather than welcome. Eleanor, too young to fully understand the social dynamics, noticed that children who had previously been friendly now avoided her. She asked her mother why. "Because your father did something people think is wrong. But he honored people who died." "How is that wrong?" "In this world, Eleanor, sometimes the right thing and the accepted thing aren't the same." Despite the social isolation, Samuel persisted. He made the changes he'd promised, reduced work hours during extreme heat, ensured regular water breaks, brought in medical care, allowed people to maintain their own gardens. These changes cut into profit margins, but Samuel found he could live with less wealth if it meant less suffering. The economic pressure was real, though. Riverside remained productive, but barely. Samuel had to take loans from banks in Charleston at unfavorable rates. He sold some of the property's equipment to make ends meet. The house renovations were put on hold indefinitely. Margaret bore the financial stress with growing resentment. She had married a successful merchant son with good prospects, not a pariah struggling to keep a plantation solvent. Was it worth it? She asked Samuel one evening after a particularly difficult conversation with their Charleston bank. The trees, the memorial, the changes to how we operate. Was it worth becoming poor and isolated? Samuel looked at her, seeing the frustration and fear in her expression. "Would you prefer we'd stayed silent?" Continued Dunmore's legacy as if nothing had happened. "I prefer we'd never bought this cursed place at all." But they had bought it, and now they had to live with the consequences of their choices, both the choice to purchase Riverside, and the choice to acknowledge its history. As Eleanor grew older, she took an increasingly active interest in the grove and its meaning. At 10 years old, she asked her father directly what had happened to the people buried there. They were sitting on the front porch on a Sunday afternoon, watching storm clouds gather in the distance. Samuel had been expecting this question for years, and had tried to prepare an answer that would be truthful without being traumatic. "They made a choice," he began carefully. "A very difficult choice about how they wanted to live and what they were willing to accept." "What kind of choice?" "The previous owner of this plantation, Mr. Dunmore, was working people too hard. A girl died from the heat and exhaustion. 14 people decided they couldn't keep living that way. So they confronted him. They told him they wouldn't work anymore, and he killed them." Samuel was startled by how directly Eleanor had reached the conclusion. "Yes." "Why?" "Because he couldn't accept that people he considered his property had the right to refuse. Because he saw their defiance as a threat to his authority. Because the law allowed him to do it." Eleanor processed this information with a seriousness beyond her years. The law was wrong. Yes. Are the laws still wrong? Samuel felt the weight of this question. How did you explain to a child that the system her family participated in, the wealth they derived from it, was built on fundamental injustice? "Yes," he said finally. "The laws are still wrong. And good people, people like you and me, have to decide what we do about that." "We could free everyone," Eleanor said with a child's straightforward logic. "Then they could choose for themselves." "It's more complicated than that." "Why?" And Samuel found himself unable to articulate a justification that wouldn't sound like an excuse. The truth was that freeing everyone would mean financial ruin, social ostracism even worse than what they already faced, possibly legal challenges. These were real consequences. But were they more important than human freedom? He couldn't say yes. But he also couldn't bring himself to sacrifice everything he had built. I don't have a good answer, he finally admitted. I'm trying to be better than Dunmore was. I'm trying to treat people with humanity and respect. But you're right that it's not enough. Maybe your generation will be braver than mine. Eleanor looked at the grove in the distance, where the dogwood trees were now tall enough to create significant shade. I go there every week, she said. I take care of the trees and say the names. Ruth taught me all of them. I think remembering is important. That's wise, Samuel said, putting his arm around his daughter's shoulders. But it's not enough either, Eleanor replied. Remembering without changing anything is just feeling sad while the same bad things keep happening. Samuel had no response to that. His 10-year-old daughter had identified the central moral failure of his compromised position, that memory without action was ultimately hollow. Ruth had been old when Samuel first arrived at Riverside, and the years continued to take their toll. By 1857, she was 78 and increasingly frail, her body finally giving out after more than 7 decades of hard labor. Samuel brought doctors from Charleston, paying for treatments that were largely ineffective, but at least demonstrated his concern. Ruth was moved to a better cabin, given lighter duties, provided with whatever comfort could be managed within the constraints of the plantation system. But she was dying, and everyone knew it. On a warm evening in June, Ruth asked to be taken to the grove one last time. Henry and Samuel carried her on a litter, setting her gently in a chair they had brought from the main house. Eleanor sat beside her, holding her weathered hand. The dogwood trees had grown substantially in the 3 years since their planting. They were now tall enough to provide real shade, their branches spreading wide. White blooms covered the trees. It was late in the season for blooming, but a few flowers remained, brilliant white against dark green leaves. They're beautiful, Ruth said softly, her voice weak. Joseph would have loved them. He always said dogwoods were his favorite. Tell me about them again, Eleanor requested. About all of them. So Ruth did, one last time. She went through all 14 names, sharing stories about each person, their quirks and habits, their laughter and tears, their dreams and fears. She spoke until her voice grew tired, until the words came slower and softer. Ruth, Eleanor said quietly. Are you afraid of dying? Ruth shook her head slightly. No, child. I've lived long enough to see these trees bloom. I've lived long enough to know their names are remembered. That's more than I expected to get. What are you afraid of, then? Ruth was quiet for a moment. I'm afraid that someday, after everyone who was there is gone, people will forget what really happened. They'll see the graves and the trees and make up prettier stories, easier stories, stories that don't ask hard questions about what people are capable of doing to each other. I won't forget, Eleanor promised fiercely. I'll make sure my children don't forget either. I'll tell them the true story, the hard story. Will you? Ruth looked at the girl beside her. Even if telling the truth makes people uncomfortable. Even if it threatens your family's position. Yes, Eleanor said without hesitation. Ruth smiled faintly. Then I can rest easy. The story will outlive me. She turned to Samuel, who had been standing quietly nearby. Mr. Brennan, you're a better man than Dunmore was. But you're still a man who owns slaves. I hope you understand what that means, what it makes you responsible for. And I hope you're teaching your daughter to be even better than you are. I'm trying, Samuel said. Try harder. Because she's going to inherit this whole mess, and she'll need to decide what kind of world she wants to live in. Make sure she has the courage to choose better than our generation did. Ruth died 2 days later, peacefully in her sleep. Samuel had her buried in the grove among the 14 she had remembered so faithfully. A 15th dogwood tree was planted over her grave, and her name was added to the journal, Ruth Campbell, Keeper of Memory, age 78. The inscription on her section of the journal, written by Samuel himself, read, ***She carried the weight of truth when others would have chosen the comfort of silence. She remembered when forgetting would have been easier. She taught us that bearing witness is sacred work, asterisk. The tensions that had been building across the country finally erupted in 1861. South Carolina was among the first states to secede, and Charleston, just miles from Riverside, became a flashpoint of the conflict. Samuel watched the approach of war with deep ambivalence. He understood the economic arguments for secession, the political grievances about state sovereignty. But he also understood that at the heart of it all was slavery, the institution that had haunted him since that conversation with Ruth 7 years earlier. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, Samuel knew that everything was about to change. The war years were difficult at Riverside, as they were at many plantations. Neighboring properties had their owners and overseers leave to join the Confederate Army, leaving the properties barely managed and production declining. Samuel, now 49 years old, was too old for conscription and had no desire to fight for a cause he couldn't fully support. But the war affected Riverside nonetheless. Union blockades made it difficult to sell cotton even when it could be grown. Confederate requisitions took food and supplies. Young men from the surrounding area were conscripted, leaving fewer workers available for harvest. And there were rumors, persistent, growing rumors, that enslaved people were escaping to Union lines when Northern forces came within reach, that they were being freed, employed, even enlisted to fight against their former masters. Henry, now 68 years old, came to Samuel in the fall of 1863 with a request that had been unthinkable 4 years earlier. "Mr. Brennan, some of the younger folks are talking about leaving, heading toward the coast where Union forces are operating. I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from someone else." Samuel had known this was coming. Who's planning to go? Grace and her children. Thomas's sons. Joseph's boys. Diana's daughter, if she can make it back from Georgia. Maybe a dozen others. When? Soon. Before winter makes travel too difficult. Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I won't stop them." Henry stared at him. "You won't?" "No. I won't organize it, won't help directly, because that could bring legal trouble on everyone who stays. But I won't stop them. I won't send dogs after them. I won't report them to the authorities. That's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Honestly. I expected you to say you'd hold them to their legal obligation, that the law said they couldn't leave, that you'd use force to keep them here if necessary." Samuel shook his head. "I've spent 10 years wrestling with the moral contradictions of this place. I'm not going to compound those contradictions by forcing people to stay when they have a chance at freedom." "They might all leave," Henry warned. "If word gets out that you're not pursuing runaways, everyone might go. Then they go. I'll face whatever consequences come." As it turned out, not everyone left. Some people, particularly the elderly and those with deep ties to the land, chose to stay, at least for now. But over the course of 1864, the population of Riverside gradually diminished as people took their chances with Union lines. Grace was among the first to go. She came to Samuel before leaving and said something he would never forget: "Thank you for the trees. For remembering Thomas and the others. It doesn't make up for anything. Doesn't change what this place is. But it meant something. Still means something." Then she was gone, walking north with her children and a small bundle of possessions, heading toward an uncertain future that was at least her own choice. The Confederacy fell in 1865. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and Samuel Brennan found himself in a world that had fundamentally changed while leaving many structures intact. Riverside survived the war physically intact, Union forces never made it this far inland, and Confederate requisitions, while burdensome, hadn't destroyed the plantation's infrastructure. But economically and socially, everything had transformed. The people who had remained at Riverside were now legally free. They could leave whenever they chose. They could negotiate for wages. They could refuse orders. Samuel called a meeting in late May 1865, gathering everyone who was still on the property. "You're all free now," he said simply. "That's not my decision or my gift. It's the law of the land. You can stay here and I'll pay you wages for your work, or you can leave and I'll do nothing to stop you. The choice is yours. Henry, now 72, and feeling every year of it, spoke first. What kind of wages? Samuel named a figure he had calculated carefully, enough to be fair, but not so much that it would bankrupt the plantation in its weakened state. And housing? Asked Judith. You can stay in the cabins rent-free if you work here. If you choose not to work but want to stay, we can negotiate rent. If you want to leave, the cabins will be here for whoever needs them. What about the land? This from a younger man named Samuel, named ironically after Samuel Brennan himself. Can we rent plots to farm for ourselves? Yes. We can arrange that. The questions continued for hours, working out the practical details of how a former plantation would operate in a post-slavery economy. It was messy and uncertain, with everyone feeling their way through unfamiliar territory. Some people left immediately, heading to cities or other regions where opportunities might exist. Others stayed, at least temporarily, because they had nowhere else to go and Riverside was familiar ground. Henry stayed. When Samuel asked him why, the overseer gave a complicated answer. I've spent my whole life on this land. Supervised people I cared about while pretending I didn't. Made choices that kept people alive, even if it meant compromising with evil. Now I'm too old to start over somewhere else. Might as well finish my days here, trying to help build something better out of the ruins. Production continued, though at a much reduced level. Wage labor was less efficient than enslaved labor, not because free people worked less hard, but because free people could refuse unreasonable demands, could take breaks when needed, could prioritize their own health over production targets. Samuel found he preferred it this way, even if it meant lower profits. There was something honest about it, about people choosing to work and being compensated for that choice. Eleanor, now 21 years old, took an active role in managing Riverside during these transition years. She had grown into a capable, determined woman who understood the plantation's operations better than her father in some ways. She also carried forward her childhood promise to Ruth, maintaining the grove and ensuring that the story of the 14 was not forgotten. She never married, which was unusual for a woman of her class and time. When people asked why, she would say only that she had responsibilities at Riverside that required her full attention. The truth, which she shared only with her father, was more complex. How can I build a normal life here, on land soaked in so much suffering? How can I plan a future without addressing the past? Until I figure out what I'm supposed to do with all this, I can't move forward. Samuel Brennan died in 1878 at the age of 66. He had lived through the transformation of everything he had built, had seen slavery end, and struggled to adapt to a new world. His last words to Eleanor were, "Don't let them forget. Whatever else you do, don't let the story die." Eleanor inherited Riverside at age 34. The property was much diminished from what Samuel had purchased 24 years earlier, reduced acreage due to sales, fewer workers, lower production, mounting debts. But it was hers, and she was determined to use it in ways that honored both the dead and the living. Her first act as owner was to hold a memorial ceremony in the grove, the first formal gathering there since Ruth's burial in 1857. She invited everyone who lived on or near the property, including the children and grandchildren of those who had left during the war. More than 50 people came. Some remembered the original 14 directly. Others knew the story secondhand, passed down through family histories. Eleanor stood before the assembly and spoke. 28 years ago, 14 people made a choice in this grove. They chose dignity over survival. Chose to die standing up rather than live on their knees. Their names were Joseph Harris, Diana Wells, Marcus Reed, Thomas Carter, Anna Price, James Foster, Eliza Hayes, William Grant, Rebecca Shaw, Daniel Brooks, Sarah Monroe, John Ellis, Catherine Wright, and Robert Stone. She paused, letting the names resonate. For years, my father and I have maintained this grove and these trees as a memorial. But memory alone isn't enough. The past demands more than remembrance. It demands that we build a different future. So today, I'm making several changes to how Riverside operates. First, I'm dividing 40 acres of land into plots that anyone who works here can purchase at fair prices, with payment plans that make ownership possible for everyone. Land ownership means security, means the ability to build something for your children. Second, I'm establishing a school on this property. It will be open to all children, regardless of background. Education was one of the things denied under slavery. Now it will be freely available. Third, I'm documenting the history of this place in permanent records. Not the sanitized version that appears in property documents, but the true history. What happened to the 14 will be recorded accurately, preserved for future generations. These were radical proposals for 1878 South Carolina. Land ownership by formerly enslaved people was still rare and often opposed by white communities. Integrated education was practically unheard of. Publicly acknowledging the violence of slavery was deeply controversial. But Eleanor persisted. She used what remained of the Brennan family wealth to implement her plans. The school opened in 1879 in a renovated barn, teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic to children who had previously had no access to education. The land sales began slowly but accelerated as word spread that ownership was actually possible. And she maintained the grove, ensuring that the dogwood trees were tended, that the bronze plaque remained legible, that every spring the white blooms served as a reminder of the 14. She also commissioned a journal, a detailed written record of everything Ruth and Henry and others had told her about the summer of 1850. This journal was kept in a locked trunk in her house, with instructions that it should be preserved and eventually made public when the time was right. Years passed. Eleanor grew older. The dogwood trees grew taller. The story of the 14 graves became local legend, though the details were often distorted in retelling. Some versions made the buried people martyrs for abolition, which wasn't quite right. They had died in 1850, before the abolitionist movement gained real momentum, and their choice had been personal rather than political. Other versions sanitized what happened, turning deliberate murders into tragic accidents, turning a confrontation about dignity into a misunderstanding about work assignments. But those who tended the grove knew the real story. They knew about Dunmore's cruelty and the impossible choice 14 people had faced. They knew about Samuel's attempt to honor them and Eleanor's commitment to preserving their memory. They knew about Ruth, who had carried the weight of truth for years. The truth, protected by those who cared enough to preserve it, endured. Eleanor never had children of her own, but she essentially adopted dozens of young people who came through her school, teaching them not just academic subjects, but also the moral lessons embedded in Riverside's history. The past can't be undone, she would tell her students. But it can teach us. Those 14 people in the grove made a choice that shouldn't have been necessary. They had to die to be free. And that's a tragedy that should never be repeated. Your generation has different choices available. What will you do with that freedom? She lived until 1899, dying at age 55 from pneumonia that her weakened body couldn't fight off. She was buried in the grove, the 16th dogwood planted over her grave. The inscription in the journal, written by one of her former students, read, Eleanor Brennan carried forward the work of remembrance her father began. She transformed a place of death into a place of learning. She proved that bearing witness is only the first step. What matters is what you do after you know the truth. When surveyor Thomas Hartwell discovered the unusual soil composition in the grove in 1891, most people who had directly witnessed the events of July 1850 were dead. Henry had died in 1875. Grace had passed away in 1880 in Philadelphia, where she had built a new life after escaping during the war. Joseph's sons, Diana's daughter, the children of the 14, most had scattered to other places, carrying the story with them, but no longer living on the land where it happened. Hartwell's discovery generated brief interest. Reporters came asking questions. Historians wanted to know the details. Local gossip speculated about what tragic event had resulted in so many graves. But Eleanor's journal remained locked away, not yet ready to be shared publicly. The truth was known to those who needed to know it, preserved for a future generation that might be ready to hear it without distorting it. The dogwood trees stood tall by then, mature enough to provide substantial shade, their blooms brilliant white each spring. The bronze plaque was weathered but still legible. And beneath the earth, 16 people rested, 14 who had chosen death over degradation, 1 who had kept their memory alive, and 1 who had tried to transform tragedy into something meaningful. The story of Riverside Plantation continued through the 20th century. The property changed hands multiple times, was subdivided, developed, transformed. The main house was eventually restored and opened as a museum. The school Eleanor founded evolved into a larger institution that continued her educational mission. But the grove remained untouched, preserved as sacred ground. Local ordinances protected it from development. Volunteers maintained the dogwood trees, and every year on July 15th, a memorial ceremony was held to remember the 14. The attendance varied over the years, sometimes dozens came, sometimes only a handful. But the ritual persisted, reading the names, sharing the story, standing in silence beneath the dogwoods. By the time of Hartwell's discovery, the story had taken on layers of meaning that the original 14 could never have anticipated. They had made a personal choice about dignity in an impossible situation. But their choice had become a symbol of resistance, of the human need for self-determination, of the price of freedom, of the weight of history. Were they heroes, victims, martyrs? Perhaps all of these, or perhaps none of these labels quite captured the complicated truth of what they did and why. What mattered most in the end was that they were remembered, not as anonymous casualties of a brutal system, not as property that had been lost, not as footnotes in someone else's story. They were remembered as people, Joseph and Diana and Marcus and the others, who had lived and loved and chosen and died on their own terms. When Thomas Hartwell completed his survey of Riverside Plantation in 1891 and submitted his report to the county, he included a notation about the grove and its mysterious graves. But he never learned the full story. The few remaining people who knew the truth had decided that some knowledge was too precious, too painful to share with casual curiosity. The graves existed not to provide answers to outsiders, but to demand questions from those who lived with their legacy. What happened here? Why did it happen? Could it happen again? What do we owe to the dead? What do we owe to the living who carry the weight of this history? The dogwood trees continue to bloom each spring, their white flowers falling like snow on the graves below. Locals said the blooms were unusually persistent in that grove, lasting longer than dogwoods elsewhere, as if the trees were determined to fulfill their memorial function as completely as possible. And every spring, without fail, someone would come to the grove. Descendants of the 14, descendants of Eleanor, descendants of others who had lived on Riverside during those tumultuous years. They would stand beneath the magnolias and the dogwoods and speak the names. Joseph Harris, Diana Wells, Marcus Reed, Thomas Carter, Anna Price, James Foster, Eliza Hayes, William Grant, Rebecca Shaw, Daniel Brooks, Sarah Monroe, John Ellis, Catherine Wright, Robert Stone, 14 names. 14 lives. 14 choices made on a hot July morning in 1850. 14 graves, all dug on the same night, all filled before dawn. The truth, once buried, had been brought back into light. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough for the living to know that the dead had existed. Enough for their choice to be recognized. Enough for their names to be remembered by someone. That was what the grove offered. Not redemption for the system that had destroyed them, not justice for the crimes committed against them, not erasure of the pain they had endured, just simple, stubborn, persistent memory. And in a world that preferred to forget uncomfortable truths, that preferred easy stories to complicated ones, that preferred silence to the hard work of bearing witness, memory was its own form of resistance. The grove endured. The trees bloomed. The names were spoken. And the question remained, hanging in the air beneath the magnolias, waiting for each new generation to answer, what will you do with the freedom they died to claim?